From the MNT-EC, the Micro Nanotechnology Education Center, and JATE, the Journal of Advanced Technological Education, this is the JATE Writer Studio. In each session, we'll have a guided conversation with the published author. We highlight the authors who publish articles in peer-reviewed journals like JATE so that they can share their story and writing process with you. We want to give authors a voice to share their tips and tricks about how to write peer-reviewed journal articles. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Mike Lesiecki. Mike is a senior consultant at the Center of Occupational Research and Development, or CORD. Today, we'll discuss Mike's article in the JATE titled Enhance Podcasts as Content Acquisition Tools. Mike, welcome and thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Tony. I appreciate the opportunity.
All right, Mike. So before we talk about writing in your JAT articles, I'd like to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. Please describe where you live and teach or where you work, and talk a little bit about your background.
Thank you, Tony. I'm currently reside in Phoenix, Arizona, and I'm a ex-ATE Center Director. Our center was opened in 1996 and focused on semiconductor manufacturing technology. It ran its usual course of funding and closed in 2017. I became an independent consultant at that point, where I worked on a variety of projects, including the one you see on my screen called Preparing Technicians for the Future of Work. My technical background is in chemical physics, and so our association with semiconductor manufacturing was a good fit for my background. I had the privilege of working at the Maricopa Community Colleges, as well as teaching at universities and working in industry as well. I got involved in the topic of today in podcast in our project where we had a podcast series, and that led to this, ultimately, the paper that we're discussing today.
Okay, thank you. All right, very briefly describe your article that we're discussing today. Just a couple of sentences. We'll talk more in detail about the article here in a few.
All right. The article has a single proposition. It says, think of podcasts as more than just listening enjoyment. You can create a valid instructional tool by augmenting a podcast. So the article briefly goes into the theoretical basis for this instructional aspect of a podcast, and then gives a very specific example of how this might actually work.
Okay. All right. So, with that being said, what is your writing background? Where did you learn to write peer-reviewed journal articles?
I was fortunate as, from my degree, from the thesis there, I suppose was my first real writing experience, but I got involved with research at the university level. And during the course of that, I was either the lead author or co-author on 27 peer-reviewed journals, mostly in the Journal of Chemical Physics, that sort of thing, technical things. But that was a bit further back in my background, maybe further back than I would like to admit. But that's where I had the opportunity to see what creating a journal article was about, what went into it, how do you constructed it. And I think writing experience, more than that, probably came from working on writing grants themselves. I mean, you're in a similar way, you're constructing arguments, you're using references carefully, you're coming to conclusions. I think that really helped as one thinks about a journal article itself.
Okay. All right. So, how did you come up with the idea for this particular article?
It came directly from experience. For example, as we were producing the podcast series, we were augmenting the podcasts with things like show notes and resource links. We were challenging the listeners to take the next step in their professional development as a result of listening to this podcast. And then it occurred to us that we were creating something here. We were creating an instructional resource that people could use for professional development. And as we thought about this more, we said, well, wait a minute, maybe there's some validity to this as an instructional tool. And that allowed us to explore the idea of sort of making this official as an instructional tool as opposed to just something that you listen to. That was the basis for it.
Okay. All right. So, did you have any co-authors for this article?
I had a lot of collaborators that I worked with closely, but I was just a single author here.
Okay. Okay. So, in your previous articles, have you had co-authors?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
I don't think I've had a single author article prior to this one.
Okay. All right. So, when you couldn't find co-authors for your, well, you just said you've never had a single author, but if you, for future reference, if you can't find a co-author, can you go at it by yourself? Which you had collaborators on this one, but for any future ones, do you think you could go at that article by yourself? And also, with
Yeah.
your previous articles, how did co-authors contribute to writing those papers?
Well, address your last point first.
Okay,
How do you work with co-authors to do a
correct.
paper? It's typically there's often a lead author that wouldn't surprise any of us, right? Who tends
Right.
to construct things, and then it's sent to others for their review and comment. I think you would like to avoid having four separate voices in an article. I mean, it makes it stick together better if you have a single voice. So how do you actually do that? There has to be a lead, and then you work from there. The co-authorship on a research paper often is structured around the contributions to the research. The person who's made the dominant contribution is often the lead author, and then others are often by agreement. The names of the authors on the paper are sometimes important, depending on the situation, but they're often organized by level of contribution. But I would say once you decide to do a collaborative paper, you just simply sit down and say, okay, I'll take the lead and I'll need help from you as we put these various sections together. So it works as a collaborative effort.
Okay, okay, all right. I've actually just got finished writing a paper with the co-author myself, and the way we did it was I did pretty much the important parts of it where we talked about how this project came together.
Mhm.
And my co-author actually taught the Cyber Fellows, which is what our paper is about. She wrote mostly on that because I was away from the classroom. So she took care of that part. We kind of collaborated on the results, and then we collaborated on the conclusion. So
Good.
that's that's about the best way to do it. Yeah. All right. So next, what did you do first once you decided you wanted to write this paper?
Well, I knew for a journal, it isn't just about, oh, here's what I did, but rather, is there a basis or prior work that one could build upon, stand upon to create this idea of a valid instructional tool? Was there a theoretical basis for it? Because I knew ultimately I'd have to support our tenet with some background research or some background information at the least. So one of my very first things was to explore how one could think about podcasts as a multimedia learning tool as opposed to just a recording. So that allowed me to into the literature research to look for a basis for that. And I was fortunate to discover there was a strong theoretical basis, essentially from 2009 on, and I was able to use that to support our ideas.
Okay. Okay. All right. So, getting into a little more about the writing. Sometimes writers feel like they don't have enough data. They may not have enough participants. They may not even have enough experience with writing papers or enough time. That is pretty much for almost all faculty members. We just don't have enough time to write a lot of papers for the majority of us. How did you know you had enough to start writing with this article?
Well, this particular article is, if you were to look at JATE publications, it's probably on the shorter side. I think it came out to be 5 or 6 pages long. So that's not terribly long. So, Tony, I didn't worry about that aspect so much, whether I had enough. I just thought, can I make an argument here? Can I support that argument? I didn't really worry about the length. And then during the actual development of it, I was able to, as the thought process went around, went on, there were some natural add-ins to the process. For example, the paper includes a logic model, which allows one to visually show the structure of the thinking here. And that I didn't have that in mind originally, but it came up as during the development process. So a funny answer to your question, I didn't worry too much about the length. I just decided I was going to go for it and see how it turned out.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. So, how do you write peer-reviewed journal articles? Do you write them from top to bottom, or do you try and do one section, then another, but not necessarily in order?
I think I really did think about the order as the paper would be eventually structured. So the introduction, I mean, I knew that. I lived that introduction. I didn't worry so much about that. But what I then started thinking, okay, what was the basis for this article? Uh, what was I going to stand on to show that this was a valid approach? And I did my literature work there, started building my arguments from there. So once I had that fundamental basis, then I was actually to go into looking at some of the data or the experiences that we had, and then I constructed that section saying, okay, this is how our experience could be used to support the argument that we're making. And then I looked as we went further into the article, as I went further into the article, I looked about how one could expand this idea to students actually doing podcasts and how that might look. And then it wasn't too difficult to see a concluding statement where I was able to simply circle back and say, look, this seems like there's a validity here. It seems like this is a real approach to instructional resources for professional development. So my thinking eventually followed the scope of the paper or the design of the paper. I didn't start with, oh, let's work on the results section, but rather my logical thinking was following the design of the paper.
Okay. All right. Did you use the JATE template when you created this paper?
I did. Uh, JAT suggested that I use that template because it does give a structure. It helps everything from the review to the ultimate publication step. And so I don't mean I forced myself, but I forced myself into that template, and that was fine. There wasn't any difficulty there.
Okay. All right. So, how long did it take you to write this paper?
You mean linear? I mean, are we talking about time in the calendar or number of
Yeah.
hours total?
Yeah.
Or...
Time in the calendar.
Oh, I probably did it over the course of a month.
Okay. Okay. Good. Good. All right. And what is your writing process? How do you come up with the ideas that go from your head or your brain down to the paper?
So it's awkward. I have a very awkward writing process. It swirls around in my head for a long time, and then suddenly it comes out. Now, I'm not a very good keyboardist. I should be, but I'm not. So often I will sketch ideas, sometimes use dictation feature of a laptop to get my ideas down, but that can be very rough. And then I'll let it sit for a while, let it sit for a day or two, and then come back and start making a real structure of it. I'm not a particularly good writer. My idea generations are pretty good, but as a writer, I don't excel. So I sometimes struggle with writing, and I often need help in an editorial or editing sense. But my idea generation is still good.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. All right. So your paper is on podcasting as an instructional tool.
Right.
How did you find references to include in your paper? I know you stated the one motivation that you got was from, I believe, 2009.
Yes.
Excuse me, but what other references did you use for this paper?
So, the answer in one way wouldn't surprise you at all, and the other way it might. So of course you use search engines to test, but a lot of that depends on if you're using the right keywords. Once you've got the right keywords down, you know you're hitting the right sort of information, right? Then I use a technique which is probably more widely used than I realize. You go into the references of those papers to find others. You're essentially leveraging what other people have done using their reference lists, going in and see which ones are relative to you, and then you build your case from using others as well as your own research. But I think it's valuable to take a, let's say, a current paper, look at what they've cited, and say, that there's some relevance here, and then you just start building up your references. So as opposed to raw searching, I use the work of others.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. So, what was the manuscript submission process like for you? What documents did you need to upload other than the article?
I was impressed that the process was fast. In my prior experience with, let's say, a conventional journal, not that JATE isn't conventional, I suppose it's not in a way. Um, that process could be 6 or 8 months long, but JAT is much faster. So I thought that was good. Number two, once I had the templates and was using them, one of the challenges was the figures that I were using. I wanted to make sure they were clean and sharp. And I was able to use Cord, where I'm a consultant, Cord resources to construct those. So I had help with the figures, which was good. But I think from then on, the upload was straightforward, and then it went into the review process.
Okay. All right. So, speaking of the review process, how was the peer review process? How did reading the reviews make you feel? And what did you do once you received those reviews?
In my case, I was fortunate. The reviews were positive. There was some very constructive suggestions, which I was able to incorporate quickly. Then I turned it around in probably less than a week's amount of time. Again, the speed of the process was, I think, a real advantage for me to be able to work with a journal like that. So the review process was positive.
Okay, okay. We just got our peer review for our journal article, and we had two. One was kind of short, one was kind of long, but they essentially said the same thing. Some of our information was out of order. So all we did was take one paragraph out here, put it down here, drop this one, and bring it up a little bit. And hey, it worked out fine. And it was very constructive because now if you read it, it's much more clear than it was before. So,
Good. Yeah.
all right. All right. So last question. What advice would you give to new writers who are starting their first peer-reviewed journal article?
Well, the advice is, I think, understand yourself in a sense of why you're doing this. What's your motivation here? Is it something internal, something that, I just want to do this for myself? Or is there other reasons that are driving it? Here, as part of our ATE project, we were looking for a dissemination opportunity. And this was a great one. A peer-reviewed, published journal article is something that could really contribute to our ATE project. So we found value there. Also, from your editor-in-chief, Peter, uh, it was really important to do this as part of the ATE community. I felt that I was contributing to the community as a whole. So I think having those ideas motivated me to do this. So what I'm saying is understand your motivations. And once you understand those, you sort of feel free to go ahead and do this article. And I think that's the way it was for me. There may be other reasons, but for me, it was understanding my internal and external motivations and then going forward.
Okay. All right. Well, on behalf of JATE, Mike, we would like to thank you for spending some time and talking with us about your journal writing process. These are all of the questions that we have for today. And everyone out there in YouTube land, we hope to see you this time next month for our next JATE Writers Group discussion.
Thank you, Tony.